king stands before his people and swears an oath. "Somewhere in this city," he says, "walks the murderer of the last king, and I will find him, and I will punish him, whatever it costs." The crowd cheers. What none of them know, what the king himself does not yet know, is that he is not opening a manhunt. He is opening an investigation into himself. Every question he asks from this moment forward will drag him one step closer to a truth so unbearable that by the end of a single day, his wife will be dead by her own hand, and he will tear his own eyes from his skull rather than look at what he has found. This is Oedipus the King, written by Sophocles almost 25 centuries ago, and it is often called the most perfectly built story ever written for the stage. Not because of what happens, but because of the order in which it happens. Nothing is hidden from us as an audience. We know, almost from the first scene, who the murderer is. The entire unbearable tension of the next 2,000 years of theatre comes from watching one brilliant, good-hearted man walk toward a truth that the whole room, except him, can already see coming. Aristotle himself, writing a century later, would hold this exact play up as the model of what tragedy is supposed to do. And once you have watched it unfold, it is hard to disagree with him. The play was written by Sophocles, a citizen of Athens in its golden age, sometime around 429 BC, performed in an open-air stone amphitheatre to thousands of citizens who already knew the myth by heart before the actors ever set foot on the circular stage. That is worth pausing on. Nobody in that original audience was wondering how it would end. The entire art of the play, for them as for us today, is not suspense about the plot, but the vertigo of watching a man discover what we already know. Sophocles opens the action in the middle of a crisis. Thebes is dying of plague, crops failing, women miscarrying, bodies in the streets, and a crowd of frightened citizens, olive branches in hand as a sign of prayer, has gathered at the palace steps to beg their king for help. Storr's 1912 translation gives us Oedipus's first words to them, warm, proud, and genuinely fatherly. "My children, latest born to Cadmus old, why sit ye here as suppliants, in your hands branches of olive filleted with wool?" He is, by every account we are given, a good king. Decisive, beloved, the man who once saved this very city by outwitting a monster. Years before the play begins, a monstrous sphinx crouched on the road into Thebes, killing every traveller who could not answer her riddle, until Oedipus arrived as a penniless outsider and solved it where every native-born Theban had failed, winning the throne and the widowed queen's hand as his reward. Hold that image of him firmly. Everything that follows is what happens to precisely that kind of man. Intelligent, admired, utterly certain of his own goodness, and utterly unaccustomed to a puzzle he cannot solve his way out of. Here is the whole tragedy in a single sentence. A king vows to hunt down and punish whoever murdered his predecessor, and the investigation he leads with his own relentless intelligence slowly, inescapably proves that the murderer is himself. A priest tells Oedipus that Thebes is dying because of an old, unpunished crime. The previous king, Laius, was killed years ago on the road, and his killer has never been found. Oedipus has already sent his brother-in-law Creon to the oracle at Delphi to ask what must be done, and Creon returns with the god's answer. The plague will not lift until Laius's murderer is discovered and driven from the land. Oedipus does not hesitate. He is, after all, the man who solved the Sphinx's riddle when every wise man in Thebes had failed. A murder investigation, by comparison, should be simple work for a mind like his. He has no idea that the case he is about to build, piece by piece, with his own relentless competence, has only one possible suspect left standing at the end of it, and that suspect is the king asking the questions. What makes the play almost unbearable to watch is how reasonable every single step looks in isolation. No one lies to him, no one frames him. He simply keeps pulling on a thread that the rest of the world, out of fear or mercy, keeps quietly begging him to drop. First, the curse he lays on himself. Standing before the whole city, Oedipus swears the oath that sets the entire machine of the play in motion. Whoever killed Laius, he declares, will be found and punished without mercy, no matter who they turn out to be. I lay my ban on the assassin, whosoe'er he be, he proclaims, and then makes it absolute. Let no man in this land, whereof I hold the sovereign rule, harbour or speak to him. Give him no part in prayer or sacrifice or lustral rites, but hound him from your homes. No shelter, no food, no prayer, no fellowship with any living soul in Thebes. That is the sentence Oedipus pronounces, in public, on a man he cannot yet imagine is himself. He even adds, with a flourish of pride he cannot know is aimed at his own future, that he prosecutes this case as if the dead king were his own father, since he now sits on that same throne and shares that same wife. Every generation that has ever staged this play has felt the same cold thrill at this moment. A man just wrote his own death sentence and signed it with his own name and did not notice. Second, the blind prophet names him. Oedipus summons Tiresias, an old blind seer who sees the truth precisely because he cannot see anything else, hoping for a quick answer to close the case. Tiresias refuses to speak, begs, in fact, to be sent home in silence, warning Oedipus that some knowledge only brings ruin. That refusal is, of course, the worst possible thing he could have said to a king who has spent his entire life proving that no puzzle is too dangerous for his mind to solve. Oedipus accuses him of plotting with Creon to seize the throne, mocks his blindness, calls him a fraud, and finally goads the old prophet past his limit. Tiresias turns the accusation back on him with a sentence so plain it needs no theatrics. I say thou art the murderer of the man whose murderer thou pursuest. The crowd and Oedipus himself hear this as madness, as slander, as exactly the kind of desperate lie a cornered conspirator would tell. He storms out, threatening the old man, utterly certain he has just survived an attack on his throne. He has, in fact, just been told the entire truth of the play, to his face, plainly, in one sentence, and dismissed it as an insult. Third, the queen begins to see it first. Oedipus's wife, Jocasta, tries to calm him by dismissing prophecy altogether. Oracles lie, she insists, offering as proof the old prophecy that her first husband, Laius, would be killed by his own son. That never happened, she says. Laius was murdered by strangers at a crossroads, and their infant son was left to die on a mountainside years before that, so the prophecy failed. But one detail in her story, a crossroads, three roads meeting, snags in Oedipus's memory like a hook, because he himself once killed a stranger at a crossroads on the road out of Corinth, in a flash of temper, long before he ever arrived in Thebes. He presses her for details, and with every answer she gives, the picture in his own memory sharpens into something he cannot unsee. A messenger arrives from Corinth with news that should be a relief. The king Oedipus believes is his father has died of old age, nowhere near his hand, but casually adds, trying to comfort him, that Oedipus was never that king's blood son to begin with. He was a foundling, given to the royal couple by a shepherd years ago on a hillside outside Thebes. Jocasta understands everything in that instant, long before her husband does. She begs him, frantic now, to stop pulling this thread. "Oh, as thou carest for thy life, give o'er this quest," she pleads. "Enough the anguish I endure." When he refuses, certain he is close to some lesser secret about his birth, she says the last words she will ever say to him. "Oh, woe is thee, poor wretch! With that last word I leave thee, henceforth silent evermore." She turns and runs into the palace. Oedipus, still not understanding, mistakes her horror for a nobleman's snobbish shame over a possibly humble birth, and presses on, delighted, calling himself a child of fortune. Fourth, the last witness breaks. An old shepherd is dragged in, the very man who was ordered decades ago to take a newborn baby up onto Mount Cathaeron and leave it to die, because an oracle had warned Laius and Jocasta that their own son would grow up to kill his father and marry his mother. This is the same shepherd who, out of pity, could not bring himself to do it, and instead gave the infant away to a stranger from Corinth, the very messenger standing in front of them now, decades later, closing the circle. The old man begs not to be made to speak. Oedipus, who has spent this entire play as the most fearless interrogator on the stage, threatens him with torture until the shepherd finally gives way. The child he saved that day, spared out of mercy, pierced through both ankles by his own father's order so that he could never crawl to safety, was Laius and Jocasta's own son. And that son grew up in Corinth, believing himself the child of foreign parents, until a drunken insult at a banquet sent him to the oracle at Delphi to ask who he really was. And the god's answer chased him away from the family he loved and straight into the arms of the family he was fleeing. The pierced ankles are even where his name comes from, the marks that never fully healed, the swelling that gave a foundling his very name. Evidence, as the shepherd himself finally admits, plain enough that no more questions are needed. There is no more room for doubt for either man on that stage. Oedipus is Laius's son. He killed his own father at that crossroads without knowing him. He married his own mother without knowing her. Everything he swore to punish, he committed himself, years before he ever swore the oath. Fifth and last, what a man does with a truth like that. Oedipus rushes into the palace, calling for a sword, calling for his wife, and finds instead a locked door, and behind it, Jocasta already hanged by her own hands, unable to survive what she now knows completely. What happens next is reported to us, not shown. Greek tragedy never stages violence directly, only its aftermath in a messenger's account, which somehow makes it worse because we must picture it ourselves. The second messenger tells the stunned chorus what he saw: Oedipus cutting his wife's body down and then reaching for the golden brooches pinned at her shoulders. He tore the golden brooches that upheld her queenly robes, upraised them high and smote full on his eyeballs, the messenger reports, and as he did it, Oedipus cried out the reason. "No more shall ye behold such sights of woe." Again and again he drives the pins into his own eyes, not to die, not to escape punishment, but because eyes that could not see the truth of his own life for 40 years do not deserve to see anything ever again. He stumbles out before the whole city, blind and bleeding, no longer a king, but simply a man, and asks to be exiled, to be sent up the same mountainside where he was once left to die as an infant, so that the story can finally close itself where it began. So what does all of this add up to? Sophocles is not really telling a story about fate cheating a good man. That reading is too easy, and it lets us off the hook. Look at what actually destroys Oedipus. It is not the prophecy. The prophecy was made and could have simply sat there, unfulfilled, if fear alone had ruled every choice. What destroys him is the exact same quality that made him a great king in the first place. He cannot leave a hard question unanswered. He solved the Sphinx by refusing to stop thinking until he had the answer. He solves the murder of Laius the same way, by refusing every warning to stop, from Tiresias, from Jocasta, from his own shepherd, each one all but pleading with him to leave the last door closed. His virtue and his ruin are the same muscle. That is the terrifying architecture Sophocles built 2,500 years ago. Not a morality tale about a bad man punished, but a study of how the very trait that makes someone excellent, relentless honesty, the refusal to look away, the need to know, can walk that same person straight into the one truth that was always going to break them, the instant they insist on following every thread all the way to its end. Here is the one thing to carry out of this play into your week. Most of us will never solve a riddle from a monster or uncover a decades-old murder. But almost all of us, at some point, stand exactly where Oedipus stood. At the edge of a question we suspect we do not want fully answered. About a relationship, a decision, a version of ourselves we have built our whole identity on. With people around us quietly saying, more or less, enough, stop asking, leave it alone. The play does not simply say, seeking the truth destroys you. It says truth arrives either way, on its own schedule, and the only real choice is whether you meet it standing up, with your eyes open, the way Oedipus insists on doing right until the moment there is nothing left to insist on. This week, notice the one question you have been quietly avoiding, and ask honestly whether you are protecting yourself or simply delaying an answer that is coming regardless of what you do. You do not need a prophecy hanging over you for this to apply. It might be a conversation with a parent you keep postponing, a number on a bank statement you have stopped checking, a pattern in your own behavior that everyone around you has already noticed and you have not. Oedipus teaches us that the delay itself changes nothing about the outcome. It only changes how much of your life has already passed by the time you finally look. Sophocles built the most tightly wound machine in the history of the stage. A good man, a fair question, and an answer that was true all along, waiting patiently for him to be brave enough or stubborn enough to find it. Oedipus lost his throne, his wife, and his sight in a single day, and gained, at the very end, the one thing he had spent the whole play chasing without knowing it, the plain, unbearable truth about exactly who he was. 2,500 years later, in a different language, on different stages, in classrooms and film adaptations, and quiet late-night arguments about fate versus choice, we are still watching him ask the question, because none of us have ever fully answered it either. If this walk through Oedipus Rex gave you something worth keeping, subscribe. A new classic every week, faithfully, in about 20 minutes. Next time, we leave the amphitheatre of Thebes for Plato's Athens, and a philosopher who asks an even bigger question: what does a perfectly just society actually look like? That is the Republic. And tell me in the comments, is there a question in your own life you already suspect the answer to, but have not yet let yourself ask out loud?